Las Vegas, Orlando, Baton Rouge, San Bernardino, and most recently Texas. With each of these cities, they have one thing in common, and that's that they have recently been victims to mass shootings. These mass shootings that have claimed the lives of hundreds of innocent civilians. With each mass shooting and with each gun violence attack in the United States, the need for a comprehensive solution grows of all more importance, and the debate becomes more prevalent in society and among legislation. Gun control issues are extremely relevant to all Americans, and that's because any type of gun control policy would affect every single person in this room and everyone in the 50 states of the United States of America. And throughout the 3 days that I spent judging the Florida Speech and Debate Blue Key Tournament, in addition to countless hours of research, I judged 12 hours worth of debates on universal background checks. And this has led me to conclude that universal background checks are not an effective way to stop gun violence. But before I get into the metrics of a universal background check, let's talk a little bit about the issue of gun violence in America. So, as you can see by this chart, these are the G8 countries, which are the most industrialized countries in the world. You see that homicides per 100,000 guns are extremely big in the United States. It's more than any other country. The United States gun problem is the most critical in the world, and that's why legislation is at the forefront. But universal background checks, what are they? According to Martinez CNN in 2013, a universal background check is different than just a regular background check in the status quo, because instead of just having background checks required for federally licensed gun dealerships, they're going to require background checks on both private shows and private sales of guns. Now, while this sounds good in theory, everyone having background checks, it's not going to work in the status quo because the system is ineffective and because it's not going to stop crime. But let's talk about how the system is ineffective. So, why won't UBCs work? Because they use the NICS system. And according to Ferris from the Washington Post in 2014, 30% of the records that are in NICS are the total records. So essentially what that's saying is that only 30% of the total records that are being sent in to into the NICS system are actually records. So what that means is that there's a big information gap. Now, proponents of UBCs would say, well, fix this information gap by having UBCs, and then all 100% of the records have to go sent into NICS. But the problem with that, according to Fix NICS in 2017, is that the system's already crashing with their 30% of the total records. So adding in more records is just going to have more crashes and perpetuate an ineffective system. This is similar to putting fuel into a car that doesn't have an engine. Like, you can keep putting in as much as you want, but if the system's ineffective and it doesn't have the right mechanisms, it's not going to actually work. But let's say that you ignore the fact that the system's corrupt and you decide to implement UBCs anyway. Well, you're going to see two things. The first is that there's not going to be an increase in guns, or not going to be a decrease in guns, and there's not going to be a decrease in crime. So why this happens is because of Mac Braid from MIC Network in 2013. He says that 80% of the total guns are from the black market. Now, why does this matter? Because any type of gun legislation, UBCs or not, is going to only be affecting 20% of the total guns because black market guns don't follow the rules. But maybe a proponent could say, well, maybe it's only 20% of guns, but if those guns are safer, there's going to be less crime in the long run. But unfortunately, that's not the case either, according to Greenberg from PolitiFact in 2015, which states that only 3% of guns that are being used in crimes are legal guns. That means 97% of the guns that are causing crime are literally going to not be affected by UBCs or not, or any type of gun policy. These gun policies are not going to be affecting 97% of the guns that solve crime. So even if UBCs were to be implemented, they're not going to decrease the number of guns and they're not going to decrease crime. So that kind of brings you to crossroads, because if UBCs aren't going to work, you can't just sit back and do nothing, right? Well, luckily, there are multiple alternatives to actually solve this gun epidemic and this violence problem that are not the universal background checks currently being proposed by legislation. And the first one is to actually fix the NICS system. This one's actually extremely practical because a few years back, there was a bill passed and there was budgeted money to go and fix NICS. But according to Yablon of the Trace in 2015, only 11.5% of that has actually been used. That means that almost 90% of this budget is sitting there and not being used to fix NICS. By actually using this money to improve the system, you can help make the background checks that are getting in place actually have quality and be good background checks. But that still doesn't solve universal background checks. And this is why a good solution would be voluntary background checks. Now, why would this be better than having mandatory background checks? Well, the answer is twofold, and it's according to Modern Rifle in 2014. The first is that law-abiding citizens are going to go through the background checks. And that's because they're not here trying to break rules. They're going to be okay with going through the background checks. But the second thing is much more important, and that's because if you're not spending law enforcement, time, resources, energy, money, all of that towards enforcing these universal mandatory background checks, you can actually divert those resources and money and time over to the actual crime, which is in the black market, which is in these crime guns, which are the ones that are not even going to be affected by universal background checks. By having a mix of voluntary background checks and reallocating resources and law enforcement over to actually solve the problem of the black market and violent crime, then you're going to not only have comprehensive background checks, but you're also going to decrease crime, decrease the amount of guns in the black market, and ultimately save lives, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. So, you might feel helpless, though, because, you're not a legislator in Congress. What kind of power do you actually have? Well, luckily, there's a few things you can do to help push this gun legislation through. The first thing you can do is call your representative and tell them to oppose universal background checks. That's something that is being debated right now in the status quo. And if we can oppose them instead of to, pardon my pun, but this is just a jump the gun solution. It's not comprehensive and it's not going to work. So by opposing this quick fix to a solution, you can actually talk about gun reform. You can actually talk about change and actually talk about things that are going to lead to comprehensive gun reform and are actually gonna save lives. So calling your representative is extremely important. But not just that, you can also spread the word through social media or talking to people and spread awareness. Before I started researching this topic, I didn't even realize that there was other solutions besides just background checks versus no background checks. But in reality, as I showed earlier, there's a ton of other ways that you could decrease the gun number, the gun problem, gun violence, without having to do universal background checks. So by spreading awareness and calling your representative, you can be proactive about changing this. Because again, it's all 50 states that are going to be affected by these universal background checks. It's you, every single one of you. So before you go shouting from the rooftops, though, let's go over a recap of what we've actually talked about today. So the first thing we talked about was that universal background checks are not the solution that should be implemented. They're ineffective, and they do not decrease the number of crime. They do not decrease the number of crime guns. So this is not the plan that should be implemented, and this is, although it's what's being said in legislation, it's simply not an adequate solution. Now, what could work is fixing the NICS system, which would allow for the background checks that we are having to be of higher quality and be able to flag people that say have a mental illness or have a criminal record, because the system's not crashing constantly. And by a mixture of voluntary background checks and reallocation of resource from the universal checks over to actually stopping black market crime and actually crime guns and illegal guns, this is going to do what we all want to do, and that's to not have another name be added to that list that I had said earlier. We all want to stop mass shootings, we want to stop gun crime and save lives, and the best way to do that is to oppose universal background checks, look to alternatives. Thank you.